The dinner shift was winding down at the Oak Room, the quiet clatter of plates the only sound in the muted, elegant space. For Alina, a 24-year-old waitress, it was just another Thursday, until she reached to clear a water glass from her only remaining customer, a man the local papers called the city's unshakable fortress, and saw the scars laddering his forearm. Alina knew those scars, not personally but their pattern, a history written in pale, parallel lines. She was a nursing student paying her way through school, and she'd seen similar markings in clinical rotations. But this was different. The man wearing them was Marcus Thorne, a billionaire developer known for crushing opponents and whose icy demeanor was local legend. In that split second, she faced a choice: perform the polite ignore or acknowledge a pain so carefully hidden. She finished clearing the table, her heart hammering, and walked back to the service station. Then, she pulled a napkin from her apron and began to write. Her pen moved quickly. She didn't write a paragraph, just a few simple words she'd learned could be a lifeline. It's okay to not be okay. You're not alone. She folded the napkin, her palms damp, and placed it quietly next to his finished espresso cup as she passed his table one last time, pretending to adjust the candle. She didn't wait for a reaction. She retreated to the kitchen, her mind racing through every clinical guideline and every personal fear. 1 in 6 adolescents has a history of self-harm, a statistic she knew by heart from her textbooks. But this wasn't an adolescent. This was a 58-year-old titan of industry, a man whose face was on the cover of financial magazines, not in the quiet pages of mental health journals. Alina's own history made the action feel less like a choice and more like a reflex. 5 years earlier, her younger cousin, Mia, had begun cutting. The family's response had been a devastating mix of panic, anger, and silence, a silence that only deepened Mia's isolation. Alina, then a first-year pre-med student, had been the only one to sit with her, to say the words no one else would. "I see you. I'm here." That experience had steered her toward nursing, toward psychiatric care. It had also taught her the brutal weight of stigma. For someone like Marcus Thorne, that stigma would be magnified by 1,000, shielded by money and power but no less isolating. Marcus Thorne's public story was one of relentless, solitary triumph. Orphaned at 16, he'd built his first real estate deal before he could legally drink, parlaying a single rundown apartment building into a multi-billion-dollar empire, Thorne Developments. His methodology was legendary. Identify a neighborhood on the brink of change, acquire properties quietly, then reshape the very skyline. He was famously ruthless in negotiations and utterly private in life. There were no interviews about his childhood, no philanthropic passion projects, no family photos leaked to the press. He was a fortress, and the city's business pages described him in terms of conquests and defenses. What the pages never described, but what every waiter at the Oak Room had quietly observed, was his Thursday night ritual. 8 p.m., a corner table, a single espresso, no phone, no companions. He would sit for exactly 45 minutes, staring out at the city lights, his expression unreadable. It was a pocket of stillness in what was assumed to be a life of constant motion. Alina had served him 3 times before this night, each interaction a masterclass in impersonal efficiency. "Espresso, please." "Thank you." His voice was a low, neutral rumble, his eyes never quite meeting hers. He was part of the furniture, a predictable piece of the restaurant's expensive backdrop. Until tonight, when the shift of his sleeve as he reached for his glass had revealed the landscape of his forearm. The scars were old, faded to silver white, but unmistakable in their parallel formation. They spoke of a past moment, or perhaps a past year, of profound turmoil. To Alina's trained eye, they weren't a current cry for help, but a fossil record of one. And that was precisely what made the sight so shattering. This wasn't a teenager in crisis. This was an adult who carried the permanent evidence of a battle he had never, in his public life, admitted to fighting. Back in the kitchen, the head chef, Andre, glanced at her pale face. "You okay, kid?" Thorne didn't complain, did he? No, everything's fine," Alina murmured, wiping her hands on a towel, but everything was not fine. She had crossed an invisible, unspoken line. In the world of high-end service, the customer's privacy was sacred. You didn't see what you weren't meant to see, and you certainly never, ever acknowledged it. Her act of writing that note was a violation of that code. It was intimate. It was dangerous. She thought of the research, the studies showing that acts of kindness trigger the release of serotonin and dopamine, chemically disarming stress. But what did that matter if the recipient perceived it as pity or worse, a threat? For a man like Thorne, vulnerability was the ultimate weakness. An acknowledgement of it could be seen as an attack. Out in the dining room, Marcus Thorne remained motionless for a full minute after she left. His eyes, which had been fixed on the nighttime skyline, dropped to the folded napkin. His first instinct was not curiosity, but cold fury. Who did this waitress think she was? What gave her the right? This was an intrusion, a microscopic crack in the armor he had spent 4 decades welding shut. He had built an entire life on the premise that his past was irrelevant, buried under steel and glass and staggering success. Those scars were a secret, even from his closest, and he used the term loosely, associates. His hand, the one marked with the faint, parallel lines, reached out and unfolded the napkin. The handwriting was neat, unassuming. The message was devastating in its simplicity. It's okay to not be okay. You're not alone. The words did not trigger a warm flood of gratitude. They detonated inside him like a silent bomb. They bypassed the billionaire, the negotiator, the fortress, and found the 16-year-old orphan sleeping in a construction site trailer, so numb with grief and fear that the only feeling he could muster was the sharp, clear pain of a blade. They found the 25-year-old developer watching his first major deal unravel, fighting the old, familiar urge to make the internal pain external just to feel some semblance of control. He had won that battle, time and again, but the evidence remained. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. A board meeting 8 years ago. A younger, aggressively confident executive had made a cutting remark about a competitor's weakness, implying the man was struggling with depression. Thorne had ended the meeting immediately and fired the executive the next day. The official reason was cultural misfit. The real reason was a terror that one day, someone would look at him and see the same thing. He had constructed a persona of impenetrable strength not just as a strategy, but as a survival mechanism. And now, a waitress with kind eyes and a steady hand had seen through it in one glance. He refolded the napkin carefully, his movements precise. The part of him that was all cold calculation assessed the situation. She was a liability. She carried a perception of him that could be weaponized. The logical move would be to ensure she never spoke of it. A word to the restaurant's owner, a generous donation to ensure her dismissal and silence. It would be clean, efficient. But the other part of him, the part that had been alone for so long it no longer recognized its own solitude, held onto the napkin as if it were a rope thrown into a dark well. He stood up, leaving exact change for the espresso plus $100 bill tucked under the saucer. He slipped the folded napkin into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket directly over his heart. As he walked toward the exit, he paused at the service station. Alina was there, arranging coffee cups, her back to him. He didn't speak. Instead, he took one of the restaurant's embossed business cards from the holder on the counter. On the back, with a pen from his pocket, he wrote a single letter, T. He placed it on the stainless steel surface where she would see it. Then Marcus Thorne, the unshakable fortress, walked out into the night, leaving behind a single, cryptic clue and a waitress whose life was about to be pulled into the silent, high-stakes orbit of a man who had just been seen for the very first time in decades. Alina found the card an hour later after the restaurant had emptied. The single, sharp T stared up at her, written in the same decisive script as the $100 tip left on his table. It felt less like a thank you and more like a cipher. Her manager, seeing her confusion, let out a low whistle. Thorne's personal card. That's not a souvenir, Alina. That's a summons. For 3 days, the card sat on her tiny kitchen table, a silent, intimidating presence. She went to her nursing classes, attended her hospital rotations in the psychiatric ward, and tried to immerse herself in the clinical language of coping strategies and neurotransmitter imbalances. But it all felt abstract compared to the visceral reality of that napkin note and its aftermath. She had acted on a human impulse, but she had intervened in the life of a force of nature. The research was clear. Stigma was the fourth highest-ranked barrier to seeking help. For a man like Thorne, the stigma wasn't just social. It was a perceived threat to an entire empire built on invincibility. On the fourth day, a sleek black town car, inconspicuous yet unmistakably expensive, pulled up outside her shared apartment building. A driver in a crisp uniform stepped out and handed her a plain white envelope. From Mr. Thorne. Inside was a single sheet of heavy bond paper, no letterhead, just a typed address, a time 10:00 a.m. tomorrow, and a handwritten postscript. The T was for trust, a scarce commodity. MT. The address was not for Thorne Developments, soaring downtown tower. It was for a nondescript mid-rise in the old financial district. At precisely 10 the next morning, Alina walked into a quiet, wood-paneled lobby and was ushered by a silent assistant into a small, sunlit conference room. It was an office, but not his main one. This was a private space. Marcus Thorne was standing at the window, his back to her. He turned, and for the first time she saw him without the filter of a waiter-customer dynamic. He looked tired. The imposing aura was still there, but it seemed layered over something else, something frayed. "You wrote a note," he began, his voice even. "It contained 12 words. In my world, 12 words can launch a hostile takeover or end a career. Yours disarmed me." He gestured to a chair. "Please." He didn't sit. He paced slowly, as if choosing his words with the same care he'd use for $1 million contract. "I have spent my life building walls, not just buildings, psychological fortifications. The scars you saw are part of an old, defeated perimeter. I believe they were buried. Your note suggested they are still visible and therefore a weakness." Alina found her voice, calm from years of speaking to frightened patients. "It's not a weakness, Mr. Thorne. It's evidence of survival. That's what the research shows. The scars are often what remain after someone has lived through something overwhelming." He stopped packing and looked directly at her. "Research, you're a student." "A nursing student, with a focus on psychiatric care." A faint, almost imperceptible nod. "That explains the phrasing. It was clinically compassionate." He finally sat, leaning forward. "I did not bring you here to thank you, though I am cognizant of the intent. I brought you here because you have presented me with a unique problem. You possess a piece of knowledge about me that no one else does. Knowledge is currency. The question is, what will you do with it?" Alina felt a chill. This was the threat she had feared, framed as a business proposition. "I have no intention of doing anything with it. It's not my story to tell." "Intentions are fragile," he countered. "They change under pressure. A larger tip, a job offer, a threat from a competitor, a moment of anger. The information exists outside of me now. You are its custodian." He slid a folder across the table. "This is a standard non-disclosure agreement. It outlines significant penalties for disclosure of any private observations regarding my person. Signing it would be the smart thing to do. It would protect you from future misunderstandings." Alina's hands grew cold. This was the fortress reasserting itself, buying silence with legal intimidation. She didn't reach for the folder. "If I sign that, it proves your point. It turns a moment of human connection into a transaction. It makes the kindness a liability to be managed. Is that what you want?" For a long moment he was silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the city below. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "What I want is irrelevant. What is asterisk is a system that punishes vulnerability. I have a board of directors, shareholders, rivals who would exploit even the whisper of this. They wouldn't see survival. They would see instability. They would attack." He was right, of course. Alina had seen the brutal corporate headlines, but she also saw the man in front of her, so imprisoned by his own power that a simple act of kindness had to be legislated into secrecy. "Then why show me the scars?" she asked softly. "Your sleeve was pushed up. It wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't hidden. Maybe some part of you wanted asterisk to be seen." Thorne recoiled as if struck. He stood abruptly and walked back to the window, his posture rigid. The question had hit its mark. The meeting, she was sure, was over. She had overstepped. But then he spoke, his voice barely audible. "My father killed himself. I was 16. He was a contractor, lost everything in a bad deal. He left no note, just a gun and a mess I had to clean up before my mother got home." He didn't turn around. The scars came later, a different kind of silence, a different kind of mess. You learn to hide all of it, you build over it. The revelation hung in the sunlit room. The origin story of Marcus Thorne was not just rags to riches. It was trauma to titanium. His entire empire was a monument built over a psychic crater. The relentless drive, the isolation, the impenetrability, it wasn't just strategy. It was a life spent running from that single, devastating moment in a trailer. Alina understood now. The note hadn't just acknowledged scars, it had inadvertently echoed the silent void left by his father's suicide, a void he had spent a lifetime trying to fill with noise and steel and money. "I'm sorry," she said, the words utterly inadequate. He finally turned. The raw vulnerability was gone, sealed away behind a mask of weary resolve. "Your note said you're not alone." A nice sentiment, but factually incorrect. "I am alone. I have designed my life that way. It is the only way it functions." He tapped the folder. "Sign the NDA. Take the confidentiality bonus that comes with it. Consider it a scholarship, and we will both go back to our respective worlds." It was the logical, safe, wall-building solution. But as Alina looked at the folder, she thought of the neuroscience she'd studied. Performing acts of kindness releases serotonin and dopamine, creating a buffer against stress. But witnessing kindness has a similar, contagious effect. By forcing this into a cold transaction, he was chemically reinforcing his own isolation. He was building another wall with her on the other side. She made a decision. She opened the folder, scanned the first page, then closed it. She pushed it back toward him. "No." His eyebrows raised slightly, a rare show of surprise. "No. I won't sign. Not because I want to expose you, but because if I do, I become part of the system that punishes you for being human. I become someone you paid to look away. And after what you just told me, I can't do that." A tense silence stretched between them. He was assessing her, not as a waitress or a student, but as a new, unpredictable variable in his carefully calculated universe. "That is a significant risk. For you." "I know. What do you propose instead?" Alina took a deep breath. "Nothing. I propose nothing. I go back to my life. You go back to yours. The information stays with me not because a contract forces it, but because I am a healthcare worker in training. My default is confidentiality, and compassion isn't a transaction, it's just compassion." For the first time, something like genuine bafflement crossed Marcus Thorne's face. He was a man who dealt in levers and incentives, threats and rewards. He had no framework for this. An asset that refused to be acquired, a risk that refused to be mitigated. "You are either remarkably principled," he said slowly, "or dangerously naive." "Probably both," Alina admitted. He stared at her for another long moment, then gave a single, curt nod. "Very well." He picked up the NDA folder and walked to a shredder in the corner. The sound of grinding paper filled the room. He was destroying the only legal instrument that could have forced her silence. It was an act of immense, symbolic trust. "The offer of a scholarship stands," he said, not turning from the shredder. "Without conditions. You will receive details in the mail. Consider it an investment in a future nurse who understands that patients are people, not problems to be managed." He finally faced her. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a board meeting where I must convincingly pretend to be the most powerful man in the room." Alina left the office in a daze. She had walked into a negotiation and somehow walked out with a semblance of her integrity intact and a scholarship she hadn't asked for. She thought that was the end of it, a strange, closed loop. She was wrong. A week later, during her rotation at the city's largest hospital, her attending psychiatrist, Dr. Evans, called her into his office. His expression was grave. Elena closed the door. He had a file open on his desk. "I've just come from a meeting with the hospital's executive board and its largest private donor. The donor is concerned about the direction of our psychiatric outreach programs. He feels they are too soft, not focused enough on measurable outcomes. He is threatening to pull a $30 million donation for a new children's wing unless the programs are streamlined, which is a euphemism for cutting the very compassion-based therapies we know work." Elena's blood ran cold. "Who is the donor?" Dr. Evans sighed. "Marcus Thorne, and he specifically mentioned being unimpressed with certain modern attitudes toward mental health that he encountered recently. He cited a naive perspective from a student. Elena, what did you do?" The room seemed to tilt. The fortress wasn't just defending itself. It was launching a counterattack. Her refusal to play by his rules hadn't been met with respect, but with retaliation, and he wasn't coming for her directly. He was aiming at the very institution that represented her future, threatening to dismantle the kind of care she believed in. The stakes had just exploded from personal to systemic. Her single act of kindness was now, indirectly, about to harm thousands of future patients. Elena stared at Dr. Evans, the walls of his office closing in. "I had a conversation with him, that's all. I told him compassion wasn't a transaction." Dr. Evans pinched the bridge of his nose. "Elena, to a man like Thorne, everything is a transaction. And now he's transacting his personal discomfort into policy. The board is meeting tomorrow. They're likely to capitulate. $30 million buys a lot of compliance." She left the hospital in a fog, the weight of unintended consequences crushing her. She had tried to do a kind thing. Then she had tried to do a principled thing. And now, a children's mental health wing, a place that could help hundreds of kids like her cousin Mia, was on the chopping block. The irony was vicious. An act meant to alleviate hidden pain was now going to systemically limit care for it. That evening, the town car returned. The same driver handed her a second envelope. Her name was written on the front in the same decisive script. Inside was a check made out to her for $25,000. The memo line read, "Scholarship, no conditions." Paperclipped to it was a note. "A demonstration of good faith. The hospital matter is separate. Do not conflate the two. MT." It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The scholarship was the carrot, a reminder of his capacity for generosity. The hospital threat was the stick, a demonstration of his capacity for ruthless consequence. He was showing her the full spectrum of his power. He could build up or tear down, and he expected her to know her place within that dynamic. By accepting the money, she would be tacitly accepting his terms, that his personal dignity was worth more than a hospital program. By refusing it, she would seem ungrateful and intensify his wrath. She didn't cash the check. She placed it, along with the first note, in a drawer. She spent the night researching Marcus Thorne's philanthropic history. It was extensive, but it followed a clear, cold logic. Donations to arts institutions, prestigious, image-enhancing, to economic think tanks, policy influence, to hospitals for new surgical wings and cutting-edge tech, visible, tangible outcomes. There was not a single public donation to any organization focused solely on mental health, suicide prevention, or community-based psychiatric care. It was a glaring, deliberate omission. The fortress didn't just defend against personal vulnerability, it funded a world that ignored the concept entirely. The next morning, she went to the hospital board meeting as an observer. The room was tense. The board chairman, an elderly cardiologist, laid out the dilemma. Mr. Thorne's donation represents 60% of the funding for the new children's pavilion. His concerns about the direction of our psychiatric outreach are vague, but his ultimatum is not. We either restructure the proposed programs to focus on quantifiable medical outcomes, removing the peer support and family therapy components, or we lose the funding entirely. A board member, a former pharmaceutical executive, spoke up. Let's be pragmatic. We can build the wing. We can fill it with beds and medicine. The soft programs can be added later through other fundraising. A half-built wing helps no one. Dr. Evans stood, his voice shaking with anger. Those soft programs are the medicine for these children. We're talking about trauma-informed care, about breaking the cycle of stigma that starts in childhood. A wing without that philosophy is just a warehouse. The debate raged, but the outcome was predetermined. Money talked. The board voted 7-4 to accept Thorne's demands and redesign the programs. Alina watched from the back, a knot of despair tightening in her chest. She had lost. He had won. The fortress remained unbreached, and its shadow had just grown longer, now darkening the future of countless children. But as she walked out, a senior board member, a woman named Patricia who ran a family foundation, stopped her in the hall. "You're the nursing student, aren't you? The one who spoke to Thorne?" Alina nodded, expecting another reprimand. Instead, Patricia leaned in, her voice low. "My foundation funds mental health initiatives. I can't counter $30 million, but I know someone who might be able to get through to him, someone from his past. It's a long shot, and it requires you to be exceptionally discreet." She handed Alina a slip of paper with a name and an address in a quiet, affluent suburb. Alina Vance. She was his high school guidance counselor, the only person, from what I understand, who tried to help him after his father died. He hasn't spoken to her in over 40 years, but if anyone has a key to that man's inner life, it's her. This was the pivot, the revelation that reframed everything. Thorne's isolation wasn't total. There had been one person who tried to reach him. Alina drove to the suburb that afternoon, her mind racing. Alina Vance lived in a modest, well-kept cottage surrounded by roses. She was in her late 70s with sharp, intelligent eyes. She listened quietly as Alina explained the situation, the note, the meeting, the hospital. Alina finished. Alina sighed, a sound of deep old sorrow. "Marcus, oh Marcus, still building walls." She invited Alina in for tea. "He was in my office 3 days after his father died," she began. "Sitting right where you are, not crying, not angry, just hollow. I told him he could talk to me, that what he was feeling was normal, that there was help. He looked at me and said, talking won't bring him back, and help is for people who can't help themselves." He walked out and never came back. She went to a bookshelf and pulled out a faded yearbook. She pointed to a young Marcus Thorne in a grainy club photo. He was in the debate club, brilliant, fiercely logical. After his father died, he dropped out, started working construction. I tried to visit him at home, but his mother, she was shattered. The grief in that house was a physical thing. I wrote him letters. He never replied, but I kept one letter he wrote back, the only one. Alina retrieved a fragile, yellowed piece of notebook paper from a locked box. The handwriting was teenage boy awkward, but the words were chillingly mature. "Mrs. Vance, thank you for your concern, but you are wrong. Strength is silence. Dependency is death. I will not be weak like him. I will be remembered for what I build, not for what I destroyed." Alina felt a shiver. The genesis of the fortress was right there, in the angry, grieving script of a 16-year-old boy. His entire life's philosophy, strength is silence, dependency is death, was a vow made to a dead father and a broken mother. He's not just protecting his reputation, Alina realized aloud. He's protecting that 16-year-old's vow. Any acknowledgement of mental struggle is a betrayal of that promise. It's an admission that his father was weak, and that he might be too. Alina nodded. Exactly. To him, funding a compassionate mental health program isn't philanthropy. It's legitimizing the very thing he has spent a lifetime defining himself against. It's an existential threat. This was the deeper layer. The hospital threat wasn't just petty retaliation. It was the fortress's immune system attacking a perceived ideological virus. Compassion, to Marcus Thorne, was the antithesis of survival. "What do I do?" Alina asked, feeling utterly out of her depth. Alina placed a gentle hand on hers. "You cannot reason a man out of a fortress he built with 40 years of grief and logic, but you might be able to remind him of who lived in the field before the walls went up. He responded to your note, didn't he? That means a part of him is still in there. The part that wrote that letter to me was in terrible pain, but it was also reaching out in its own way. You have to reach that part, not the billionaire, the boy." Alina returned to the city, armed with a terrifying new understanding and no clear plan. That night, she received a call from an unknown number. It was Dr. Evans, and he sounded panicked. "Alina, it's worse. Thorne's lawyers just contacted the university. They're questioning the ethical fitness of a nursing student who harasses private citizens about their medical history. They're implying you breached confidentiality. They're not filing a suit, but the inquiry alone. The university is putting your scholarship and your placement under review." The attack had escalated from institutional to personal. He was now coming for her future directly. The message was clear: stand down or be erased. The no-conditions scholarship had been a test, and by not cashing it, she had failed. Now the pressure was being applied in the most efficient way possible, through the bureaucracy of her own education. Alina sat in her dark apartment, the 2 notes and the uncashed check on the table before her. She was at a crossroads. She could capitulate, cash the check, stay silent, let the hospital programs be gutted, and hope Thorne's lawyers lost interest. She could save her own future, or she could double down on the principle that had started this, that compassion matters, that silence kills, and risk everything. She thought of Alina Vance's words, "You have to reach the boy." She thought of the 16-year-old Marcus, writing that he would be remembered for what he built. And she made her decision. She would not try to storm the fortress. She would send one more message into the silence. But this time, it wouldn't be a generic note of comfort. It would be a specific, undeniable reflection of the pain he had spent a lifetime building over. It would be an act not of clinical compassion, but of brutal, mirror-holding empathy. It was a nuclear option, and it would either break the siege or get her destroyed. She picked up a pen and a fresh piece of paper. She didn't write to Marcus Thorne, the billionaire. She wrote to the 16-year-old boy whose father left a gun and a mess. She wrote the letter she wished someone had given him 42 years ago, and when she was finished, she knew exactly how she would deliver it. The next move was hers, and it would change everything. Alina did not mail the letter. She didn't trust the anonymity of an envelope. Instead, on Thursday evening at 7:45, she walked into the Oak Room, not in her waitress uniform, but in simple, plain clothes. She asked for a corner table. She ordered a single espresso, and she waited. At 8 o'clock exactly, Marcus Thorne entered the restaurant. He saw her immediately. His step faltered for a fraction of a second, the only sign of surprise. He recovered, his expression settling into its usual impassive mask, and walked to his usual table. He did not look at her. He sat, ordered his espresso from a nervous new waiter, and stared out at the city lights. Alina's heart was a drum against her ribs. This was it. She waited for her moment. When the waiter brought Thorne his drink, she stood, walked over, and placed the sealed letter on the white tablecloth beside his cup. She didn't say a word. She simply met his gaze for one long, silent second, then turned and walked back to her own table. He stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. His name was written on the front. Not Mr. Thorne, just Marcus. For a full 3 minutes, he didn't touch it. He drank his espresso, his movements mechanical. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to come from the very foundations of him, he picked it up, slit it open with his butter knife, and began to read. Alina watched from across the room. She saw his shoulders stiffen. She saw his jaw tighten. She saw him read it a second time, more slowly. Then he did something extraordinary. He lowered the letter, closed his eyes, and pinched the bridge of his nose. When he opened them again, they were not the eyes of a billionaire assessing a threat. They were the eyes of a man seeing something he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The letter was short. It read, "To the 16-year-old boy who had to clean up a mess no child should ever see, you were right. Talking wouldn't bring him back, but silence didn't either. It just built a very tall, very quiet prison. Strength isn't the absence of pain, it's carrying it without letting it define you. You built an empire to prove you weren't weak. What if you used a piece of it to prove that pain isn't shameful? Not for him, not for you, not for the kids in that hospital wing. They don't need a warehouse. They need someone to tell them they can survive the mess too. You know that better than anyone. Alina. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in his inner jacket pocket, the same place he had kept her napkin note. He finished his espresso, paid his bill, and stood. He paused by Alina's table on his way out. He didn't sit. He just looked down at her, his face unreadable. "You have a formidable understanding of structural weakness," he said, his voice low. "It's not weakness," she replied quietly. "It's load-bearing grief. You've been carrying it alone. The architecture is sound, but the foundation is tired." A ghost of something, not a smile but an acknowledgement, flickered in his eyes. "The board meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m., he said. Then he turned and walked out. Alina had no idea what that meant. Was it a warning, a statement of fact? She spent a sleepless night, the letter's fate and her own future hanging in the balance. The next morning, the hospital board reconvened. The atmosphere was resigned. The vote to capitulate to Thorne's demands was a formality. Dr. Evans looked defeated. Alina waited outside, unable to bring herself to go in. At 8:55, Marcus Thorne arrived, flanked by two assistants carrying document boxes. He walked past Alina without a glance and entered the boardroom. The meeting was called to order. Through the door, Alina could hear the chairman's voice, then Thorne's, calm and clear. "I've reconsidered my position on the children's pavilion," he began. "The original program designs, including the family therapy and peer support components, are not only acceptable, they are essential. My $30 million donation stands, with no alterations to the proposed mental health programs." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. The chairman sputtered, "But Mr. Thorne, your earlier concerns were misplaced," Thorne interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Furthermore, my foundation will be establishing an additional endowed fund of $5 million specifically for research into reducing stigma in pediatric mental health care. The work must be done, and it must be done with compassion, not just clinical efficiency." There was a stunned silence. Then Dr. Evans's voice, thick with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. This will change countless lives." Thorne's response was pragmatic, but the words carried a new weight. "See that it does." He then added, "There is one condition unrelated to the funding." The room grew quiet again. "The nursing student, Alina, whose placement was under review. That review is to be concluded immediately, with a full endorsement of her ethical fitness. Her perspective is an asset to your field." The siege was over. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with a strategic, deliberate lowering of the drawbridge. He had not torn down his walls. He had simply opened a gate. After the meeting, Thorne left quickly, avoiding the crowd of relieved board members. Alina found Dr. Evans in the hall, beaming. "He did it. He overturned everything, and he protected you." He shook his head in wonder. "What did you say to him?" Before she could answer, one of Thorne's assistants approached. He handed Alina a small, elegant business card. On the back, in the familiar script, was a new message. "The scholarship check was voided. A new one will be issued. The terms are different. It is now an investment in compassionate infrastructure. You are to oversee the Student Advisory Committee for the new pavilion's programs. Consider it a paid internship. Report to Dr. Evans." It was a total recalibration. He wasn't giving her charity. He was offering her a role. He was leveraging her naive perspective into a formal position within the very system he had threatened. The transaction was no longer about her silence, but about her voice. Weeks passed. The hospital project moved forward with renewed energy. Alina's academic review was closed with a glowing commendation. She cashed the new scholarship check, the memo line now reading "advisory internship." The world did not learn Marcus Thorne's secret. The fortress remained, externally unchanged. But one Thursday evening, Alina returned to the Oak Room for a coffee. At 8 o'clock, Marcus Thorne walked in. He took his usual table. Their eyes met across the room. He gave a single slight nod. It was not friendship, it was recognition. An acknowledgement that they now inhabited a shared, silent understanding, a fragile bridge built over a deep chasm of private pain. The story should have ended there, a quiet, hopeful resolution. But 6 months later, a final, surprising detail emerged, one that showed the true domino effect of that first napkin note. The business pages reported that Marcus Thorne had quietly dissolved his long-held majority stake in a chain of for-profit psychiatric hospitals known for their minimal therapy, maximum medication approach. In its place, he invested in a network of non-profit community mental health clinics. There was no press release, no publicity, just a line in a financial digest. Furthermore, through an anonymous donor-advised fund, a substantial grant was made to a national organization providing suicide prevention training in high schools. The grant was earmarked specifically for programs targeting young men. Alina heard about it through Dr. Evans. She knew with absolute certainty who was behind it. He wasn't building a monument anymore. He was quietly, anonymously, dismantling the very architecture of silence that had almost consumed him. He was funding the help he never got, for the 16-year-old boy he once was, and for all the others like him. The fortress still stood, but inside the boy was no longer alone. And outside in the world its shadow had once darkened, gardens were beginning to grow. So what is the true architecture of compassion? This story suggests it is not a grand design gesture, but a series of small, brave actions. Seeing, acknowledging, refusing to look away. That over time can alter the landscape of a human life, and by extension, the world around it. We are all, in our own ways, building fortresses. Not of steel and glass, but of busyness, of curated personas, of the stories we tell ourselves and others about who we are and what we can withstand. The most imposing walls are often constructed to hide the very things that make us human, our fragility, our past pains, our silent struggles. Alina's napkin note was a message slipped under the gate. It carried no demands, no expectations of change. It simply said, "I see you." And in a culture where 1 in 6 adolescents bears the hidden weight of self-harm, and where stigma remains one of the highest barriers to seeking help, that simple act of seeing is revolutionary. The science confirms it. Acts of kindness trigger a neurochemical cascade, serotonin, dopamine, that can begin to dissolve the physiological bedrock of isolation and stress. Marcus Thorne's journey from fortress to fractured to, finally, a facilitator shows that healing is not about demolition. It is about integration. It is about bringing the exiled parts of ourselves, the grieving boy, the scarred survivor, back into the blueprint. His anonymous funding of suicide prevention programs is perhaps the most telling outcome. It is compassion, strategically deployed not as a weakness, but as the ultimate revision of a lifelong, flawed vow. This is not a fairy tale. No one was magically cured. He still sits alone at his table on Thursday nights. She is still a student navigating a difficult path. But a bridge exists between them now, built on a shared, unspoken truth, that our scars are not signatures of failure but records of survival. And that sometimes the most powerful thing we can build is not a wall but a connection. The lingering question this leaves us with is not about them but about us. Who in your life is living behind a fortress so convincing you've stopped wondering what's inside? What small, brave action could you take? A note, a quiet question, a moment of withheld judgment that might slip beneath the gate. The domino effect of a single act of compassion is immeasurable. It starts a chain reaction that moves through individuals, through institutions, and into the quiet, anonymous reshaping of the world. It begins when we choose to see the person behind the persona and acknowledge the pain behind the power. Thank you for following this story. If it resonated with you, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe in the quiet power of human connection, consider subscribing. Your support helps bring more stories like this one to light. Remember, the world is changed not by the loudest voices, but by the kindest glances and the notes we dare to write.